Well, welcome to week two of the course. I hope you had a good weekend. And let's get down to the business at hand. And the lectures this week, the material presented this week, is going to be among some of the most important of the entire semester. You really need to want to bear down this particular week so that you get the proper foundation that will allow you to succeed with much of the material presented in the balance of the course. So with that having been said, let me just get started with the sharing the screen with you. Okay. And this always seems to be a little awkward there. Okay, all right. Okay, here are the key terms for today's lecture, which is, by the way, going to be in two parts. I've decided to break it into half. And as always, bear in mind that many of the terms are going to end up appearing on your quizzes and your examinations. So that's what the key terms are there for in the first place. By the end of this lesson, you should understand actually quite a bit. First, you should understand that moral values continue to apply in war. Second, you will understand the basic elements of just war doctrine. Third, you'll understand the basic facts and significance of the My Lai massacre, which occurred during the Vietnam War in March 1968. Next, you'll understand the concept of moral injury, and also the concept of betrayal of Thamus, which is a Greek term, translates basically as what's right. So we're talking about betrayal of what's right. Then the importance of the warrior code in protecting soldiers from psychological harm. And finally, the role of the warrior code in preventing damage to the war effort of a given country. Now, since we're going to be drawing very heavily on the code of the warrior this semester, let me talk a bit about why I have assigned the book and why I place such a high value upon it. Well, that's on the left, that's obviously the book's author, Shannon E. French. She's currently a professor of ethics at Case Western University. But before going to Case Western in 2008, she taught philosophy at the United States Naval Academy for 11 years. And the Code of the Warrior is an outgrowth of an elective course that she developed at the Naval Academy. Now, some of you may be unfamiliar with the Naval Academy and perhaps some of the other service academies, so let me kind of bring you up to speed. Briefly, the U.S. Armed Forces draw their officers, their officer corps, from three sources. Overall, about 37% of U.S. officers are products of the Reserve Officer Training Corps. College undergraduates who take courses in military science or naval science or whatever as the case might be, who receive some military training during their undergraduate years, and upon graduation receive not only their university degrees but also their commissions as officers. And you yourself, watching this presentation, may be on that path. If not, a number of your classmates undoubtedly are. We have an enrollment in this course of 149 students, and for obvious reasons, ROTC students tend to take courses in military history. So that's one segment, ROTC. Next, a relatively modest number of officers are products of the Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia, but I don't need to get into that in any detail. The rest are products of the service academies, chiefly the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York, the U.S. Air Force Academy at Colorado Springs, Colorado, and the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland. And these are four-year schools where future officers get their undergraduate educations. So in that sense, there are liberal arts colleges where you happen to wear uniforms and certain regulations apply and this kind of a thing. But but they're getting the same basic kind of education in the respect that you're getting. Well, French was there at the Naval Academy, teaching philosophy, and she was concerned with how she could use philosophy to provide practical assistance to these future officers. And pondering this, she realized that these were really future warriors who would be responsible for leading other warriors. And so part of her purpose in developing the elective course was to help them think more deeply about their identity as military women and men. Because as many of you may be aware, most career personnel in the military regard themselves as part of a distinctive culture. The midshipmen at the Naval Academy, and midshipman is simply the name for a student at the academy, were drawn to the course, a very popular course, drawn to the course because it helped them to understand more deeply the culture and the values of the profession to which they planned to dedicate their lives. And much of the Code of the Warrior offers a deeply insightful and even unexpected view of how warriors across time and space, from ancient Greeks to Vikings to Native Americans on the Western Plains to the Japanese samurai and other cultures as well, created their own warrior codes that were in some ways distinctive, but that actually shared a lot of commonalities. I first assigned the book in 2007. That was my fourth year teaching the course. And of course, I've assigned the book ever since for a period now of 13 years. And in 2007, I looked like this. And as you may have noticed, still had a reasonable amount of hair that was still dark brown. But it really tracks back to when I looked like this. And that's me at age 20. And yes, back then that was actually a normal look. I wasn't trying to go for the John Travolta and Saturday Night Fever thing. That's just, how 20-year-old sophomores at Ohio State routinely looked back in the day. Well, that's a detail, a crop from this photo here. And let me tell you about this. I'd been invited to be a participant in the week-long National Security Seminar held each year at the U.S. Army War College, where almost 30 years later, I would spend 2 years as a visiting professor. And at the Army War College, and there's also a Naval War College and an Air War College, but in the Army War College, Army Lieutenant Colonels spent a year there to prepare them for top-level assignments as generals or senior staff officers, but in any event, assignments that would carry them from the realm of operational art, which has to do with leading forces in battle, to the realm of national security policy, where officers would be interacting with civilians on a regular basis. And so what you're looking at in this photograph are the members of Seminar Group 6. The Army War College had and has 20 such seminar groups, each consisting of a number of officers. And by the way, not just Army officers. By law, you had to have some naval officers and Air Force officers and so forth, at least you do nowadays. And there were a number of what were called international fellows. These were officers from other countries. And so I was part of seminar group 6 when I was at this national security seminar. And that's the group photo that was taken of us. Well, the deal was, once again, that these officers, having spent their careers up to that time principally on military posts and away from a civilian community, needed to understand at this new point in their careers how civilians thought and felt about a variety of things: domestic policy, international policy, defense policy, specifically Army policy. We dealt with all those things during the course of the week-long national security seminar. And the year that I was there, 1980, the guests included an NFL coach, a producer of the CBS Evening News, a social worker. If you can make out me, I'm in the front row, almost always to the right. You can, the distinctive black flared shirt sort of gives me away. Well, the social worker is to my right, and then to my left is the owner of a coal mining company. And so the Army War College intentionally invited Americans from all walks of life to interact with these officers. And I was one of 2 college undergraduates who were invited to participate. My opposite number was 22 years old. I was 20, which made me the youngest participant there. Now, like you, I was an undergraduate right here at Ohio State back then. And just as you are doing now, I took a course in military history. Well, that's actually not quite right. I took 7 courses in military history, which helps to explain why I'm a professor of military history today. So the professor who had the biggest influence on me back then was a big fan of Thucydides. This was an Athenian general who became a historian of the Peloponnesian War, this tremendous conflict between the Greek city-states of Athens and Sparta. And you'll encounter Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War, of which he wrote, in week 5 of the course. But for right now, it's enough to know that the professor completely agreed with Thucydides that war was a moral no man's land of ruthless expedience in which, to quote Thucydides, the strong do what they can and the weak accept what they must. So Thucydides thinks that morality doesn't apply in war. My professor thought that morality didn't apply in war. Well, it turned out that the Army War College didn't see things that way, and that there was a course there on the ethics of military officership and another on the ethics of war, both of which insisted that Thucydides be damned. Moral considerations did matter in war and mattered profoundly. And as you'll see when you read the first chapter of the Code of the Warrior, and when I introduce you to its basic argument in my next presentation, the conviction that morality continues to matter in war turns out to be crucial to the need to protect combat servicemen and women from potentially devastating psychological harm. Well, when I returned to Columbus, I brought the syllabi from both courses with me, just brought them home with me, and as well as several books that were generously given to me. And I began a serious study of the problem of moral judgment in war that has continued down to this day. And I think you can begin to understand why the Code of the Warrior then would be of interest to me when I ran across the book and began to assign it. There's a lot to that story, but you begin to see I think, the connection between what I regard as a subject of compelling importance and the book that Shannon French wrote. But the first thing that I studied was the way in which early Christians approached the problem of war and morality. The earliest Christians were pacifists, but when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in 312 AD, Christians had to grapple with the challenge of reconciling Christian values with all the challenges of governance, because Christians, since it was the official religion of the Roman Empire, Christians were now responsible for that governance and all that was involved with the challenges of administration and administering justice, and of crucial importance here, the military defense of the Roman Empire. But how was a religion founded on the basis of universal love and peace supposed to reconcile those values with the values needed to wage war? How to bring those into harmony? Was it possible to do it? Well, a number of Christian thinkers tackled this problem, but the most important of them was Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine. Augustine evolved what has become known as just war doctrine, which has had an extraordinary impact on the laws and customs of war and the development of international law, and it remains important down to this very day. Now, Augustine saw the problem of war as being in two parts. First, when was it morally permissible to resort to war? And the principles relevant to that question were known collectively as the jus ad bellum. Second, once a war had begun, how was the war to be conducted in a moral way? The principles relevant to that question were known collectively as the jus in bello. And of course, we're dealing with, these are Latin phrases, okay? And they simply mean the law concerning resort to war, the law concerning the conduct of war. And as far as I'm concerned, you don't need to use the Latin phrases. If you understand these two categories, you know, that's perfectly adequate. Now, over the course of a number of centuries, Christian thinkers worked out in detail the principles of the jus ad bellum, the law concerning resort to war. And so in addition to Augustine, the most important Christian thinker was St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. He's at the top of the slide. And then in the 17th century, just war doctrine moved into the realm of the secular. It was no longer a Christian concern only. It moved into the realm of the secular when the first important secular thinker on the subject emerged, a Dutch jurist named Hugo Grotius. And the principles that Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas and Grotius and others arrived at are basic to the way we conceptualize a just war today, although there are some interesting differences. Here are the 6 criteria, the 6 principles. And as you see, first, you can only wage war as a last resort. So you have to try negotiation first, economic sanctions, whatever you can without actually going to war. And that seems pretty obvious, but then, how do you define when you've reached the point of last resort? Secondly, not just anybody can start a war. The decision to make war must lie in the hands of a legitimate authority, which in practice meant the ruler of a country, a monarch or an emperor. To start an insurrection, on the other hand, which is to say, to take up arms to resist the ruler of a country if he were a tyrant, for example, was more or less intentionally ruled out of bounds by the principles of just war doctrine. In that respect, just war doctrine has or had heavy bias in favor of stability and the status quo. Well, third, you had to have a just cause, not just self-defense alone, which is kind of the way we think of a just cause today. We sort of collapse it into that self-defense realm. But the just cause amounted to an intention to protect and to preserve justice. And so kicking Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait in 1991, for example, was an example of a just cause. He had invaded a country, Kuwait. That kind of aggression was unjust, and so the cause that the United States and a number of allied countries undertook was in the service of restoring justice to the situation. And another just cause, arguably, was toppling Saddam Hussein's murderous regime altogether in 2003. But suppose that when the United States decided to topple Saddam Hussein in 2003, its real objective was not to eliminate, a murderous regime that had done all kinds of things that were wrong, violated international law in a variety of ways, and acquired or still had weapons of mass destruction and all of this kind of a thing. These were the arguments put forward as in terms of the just cause for going to war against Saddam Hussein. But suppose that the real intention, was to acquire the Iraqi oil fields, which is what some critics actually thought was the case. They disbelieved the Bush administration's stated cause for going to war and thought, well, the real deal is they want to get a hold of that oil, those oil fields. Well, if that were the case, then by the tenets of just war doctrine, it would mean that the United States lacked the right intention. And so it wasn't enough. Last resort wasn't enough. Legitimate authority wasn't enough. Just cause wasn't enough. You also had to have a right intention in terms of making war. Now, reasonable chance of success, that's an interesting concept. And the governing idea behind reasonable chance of success is that in a war, a lot of people are going to lose their lives. And life is sacred. And so the first four principles aren't enough, because you might have last resort, legitimate authority, just cause, right intention. But if you don't have a reasonable chance of winning, then essentially you are simply going to throw away all those lives for nothing. And then finally, proportionality. Now, this one's pretty simple. If somebody takes a baseball bat to your windshield, you can't shoot him in return. And by the same token, the scale of a military action that is undertaken has to be reasonably related to the level of the injury received. And so perhaps a limited military incursion can't be met with, an all-out nuclear retaliatory strike, to use a kind of an absurdly exaggerated illustration. So we have the principles of the law concerning resort to war. Let's pause here, and when we resume, we'll look at the question of the just conduct of war, which, as you'll see, will quite quickly bring us face to face with the question of why warriors need a code.